Let's see. Does this work? Can I get a confirmation? Okay, great. And just so everyone is aware, there everything is currently in the on the site. So you can also find these here. And someone said start. Well done, Gabby. Um, so I I chapter three I thought was really interesting, similar to chapter two in terms of like going through the process that Nicola goes through. And unlike so chapter two was kind of the dumbbell plot, which I think we can kind of think of as like kind of edits to the scatter plot. You've got a scatter plot with categorical data on one side and points on the other. This is really a line chart. And so I like how she seems to be thinking about what are different kinds of charts and how can we work through the same process with all of them. Something else I also appreciated, and I'm curious what other people thought about working through this, was the ways in which positron might actually make some of the work that she went through even a little bit easier. So I'm gonna like try to point that out as we get there. So the first thing is um, I first of all am curious about like this feels like this is her cycle. And so like I took each of the chapters and each of the subheadings for the chapters, and I sort of just wrote them out. Um, and I sort of just wanted to first of all, like it feels like she is very much in the spend time exploring your data, create a sketch, and then kind of from that sketch go back to R and try to prepare the plot. And I was wondering, does this feel like this matches with the earlier chapter and then also like other reading that people may have done?
It definitely lines up with what I've seen in a lot of other readings where like they lean heavily on make sure you're exploring your data, understanding what your different variables and columns mean, and just getting a feel for it so that you're not randomly creating charts and visualizations or just, when you're creating those charts that you're going to present, that's the first time you're really getting in there and seeing data structure is and how it's set up.
Yeah, I think something that was almost also missing was like the why did she choose this variable in particular? Like I sort of was wondering for some of these, especially with Tidy Tuesday, there's many, many different variables. And so it's like, how did she come to this? And I know that, I mean, she's drawing upon her own experiences, but I wonder also if there could have been a like, why didn't she choose something else? And so working through the same stuff. So in the exploration, if you were to load this data set, um, I went ahead and when I worked through this using Nicola's work, I kept everything within the tidyverse. And so this is like really similar to what she did, just like if you were instead to have it using, instead of doing bar plot, which I think is what she uses, if you were to instead you do the tidyverse, you can see it's almost it's very, very similar. Um, I also, just so people are aware, I nearly always, some people will ggplot and have data within. I nearly always put my data outside and pipe because I always feel like you start with the data. And so that's something that like, you might see that mine looks slightly different than Nicola's, and it's almost always just because I put my things outside and pipe through it. And so this is where the noticing was that Nicola came to that when you have these different area deprivation indexes, that it's not what she would assume would happen, which is the places, I think that she assumed that there would be an easy pattern, like places that are less deprived would have more museums, and she did not see that. Something I'll also say, something that I was trying to think about while reading through the chapter is whether there could be bias, because we actually don't know that there's an equal number of deprivation areas across the United Kingdom. And so there is like sort of an assumption, I feel like, that there are those equal areas. And so this is why you can, so this like normalized plot is kind of standard. But if there were fewer places that were less um, deprivized, deprivatized, then like actually it being down might still be as a percentage, it being very high. And so that was something that I was kind of curious about while I was working through this. Is like I thought this was interesting, but I could see why she made the choice eventually of standardizing it as opposed to working through this. And I'll also say, let me just pull up my positron version of this. So what I will say is something that I like, and this is when I made the move recently from our studio to positron. The biggest thing that I love about positron is this is the data set that Nicola was working through. And this is what it would look like in our studio, where you would see the data as it is. But what I love in positron for data exploration is this extra little thing you have on the side where you can actually see, like, they usually give you tiny histograms of everything. And what I always really love it for is it also gives you the percentage of missing values. And so, for instance, like following Nicola's work, it's like you maybe using address would actually not be great for this data set if you were to try to think of something else because there's so many missing values. And so from her part, I could see why she went with the year opened and year closed. And those seem like natural fits because they have no missing values. And so it was just like something that trying to see how she was getting there was something that I noticed and really thought was interesting. I also kind of think it's interesting that you, even though the area deprivation index was given, there were also some like fundamental statistics about those areas. Like if you wanted to compare where museums are to crime rates, you could sort of do that. There were like other further explorations that looked like there was kind of missing for. So what did she do from this? She sees this and she made a sketch. And I was wondering what people thought of. So the sketch was, I know that there's area deprivation index, and I also know that the year open and year close are variables that are complete in the data set. There's that 0% missing values. And so I feel like that's where she got to with this exploratory sketch. It's like if I know that the year opening and the year closing are here, then I can figure out how many there are in any given year, and I can see how that changes over time with each of the deprivation indexes. I was wondering what other people were thinking about when they saw this sketch.
Yeah, I really like the idea of the sketch. Previously, when I've taught statistics in my classes before, like, oh my goodness, years and years ago, I always taught them this. I was teaching it in Excel at one point and then in R. And I always said, start with a sketch of what you want to do and then start modifying that. The one thing I don't like about her sketches is that she doesn't have, I guess she has them maybe in her mind, but you don't know what the variables are here, sort of like, because everything is like squiggle lines. And then why put the numbers and not write text? That always like confuses me. So I would have added the way I would used to do them is like with arrows, and then I would just put an arrow and say, this is my X variable, and then this is my Y variable. And if I have another one for like color or categories, I also added that too. And then maybe some text just to give an idea instead of those squiggly lines. So to me, it's not like like the sketch is a great idea, but I don't think she has them finalized. And then, so then that takes away from the whole point of doing a sketch. I feel like I don't know. Because for me, if you're gonna do a sketch, what you're doing is like sort of processing what goes where, and that includes text to me. But anyway, I don't know. Maybe I'm being too picky, or maybe I'm being too focusing on details, but to me that's what a sketch is, right? But anyway, I don't know. So that's what I thought. I wish I would have seen more of that. But then again, with the idea, it's what is in those plots, what you just said. I think that makes sense, right? Like the trend of counts from beginning to end.
Yeah. I also think, I mean, what was sort of unstated was that the the ideal data set to make this sketch is actually not a data set that exists yet, right? Because to make this sketch with year, which as the x-axis, that's actually not something that we know. We know when museums, we'll get to this because the opening and the closing is actually a little messy, but we have we don't, the ideal tidy data set for this would have every row would be a year, and currently every row is a museum. Was there anything else that people noticed? Well, then let's move ahead. So I think I'm actually going to do them. I'm going to do the stuff from now on within positron, only because then if we have questions about where things are and what they do, we can just do it straight in the code. So the first thing that Nicola does is trying to figure out. So I know that what with the goal in mind of here, let me make sure this is bigger. With the goal in mind of everything becoming every row is a year, and a year that has every the count of museums that are currently open by area deprivation index, then she knows, okay, so this is what I'm starting with, but there's a problem. And so the problem is when you go to that year open and year closed, you'll notice that the data is actually like super messy in that so the year opened, for the most part, there are two numbers. And what those two numbers represent is like two estimates of what it could be to be a minimum and a maximum for if they were unsure whether something opened in, I don't know, 1984 and 1985, they would just put both. And similarly, year closed is also messy because instead of having an NA for year closed for things that are still open, they coded it as 9999. And so and even this one, you see, this one closed sometime in between 2007 and 2017. What is this museum? That's very interesting. So the Woodland Heritage Museum, somehow it it had a 10-year span where in some point in those 10 years it closed. And so what is the best way to deal with this? Nicola decides, well, first of all, I need to separate these. And then I basically need to take the average of them, or if it's year closed, I need to code it as NA. And so what you can see is what she does is she selects these, and the first thing she does is drop NA, which she actually doesn't need to do because, as we saw before, year open and year closed were complete data sets. And she uses separating wider by a, a delimitating thing. And so if you look at the delimiter here, it is the comma. And so if you take year open and split into comma, you can then widen your table to be opened one and open two. And you can do the same thing with year closed. Again, take that comma and you'll be closed one and closed two. And then what she needs to do is, because these were strings, if you notice, these are str, so these are string variables. So the next thing she does is she mutates, which from the tidyverse means that you're making you're changing something. You're either defining or changing. And so she says, across these four variables, the four that I've just made, can you please make them numeric? And then the other thing, this is a different mutation, is for the area deprivation index, can we make that a factor? And so making it a factor will mean that if I do things later on, then making averages and doing those things, I'm not going to keep it as an integer, which would then like play around where if you're trying to do groups, you can't group integers, but you can group factors. And so she's done this, and then what she then does is she wants those 9999s to become NA, so that they will not exist, so they'll be out of the data set. And then she wants to be closed and opened to be, let's just take the best guess for these. And so in hers, she actually has an if-then statement here, where the if-then was if they're the same, then just make it the same. I only removed that because if two numbers are the same, the average of two numbers that are the same is the number. And so I actually realized you don't actually need that. You don't need to make it a complicated if-else statement. You can actually just keep it as is. And so close would be the closed two and closed one divided by two. Opened would be open two, open one divided by two. Let's round it so that it's to the nearest year. So we don't have 0.5s like rolling around here. And then select those just that deprivation index, that open and that closed. I'm going to rename this because it's going to be easier. I'm going to arrange it by that. So if I run this, which I'll do now, and I look at my data set is closed. Now it's almost where I need it to be for the sketch, which is it has every museum has been converted into I've removed the name, I don't need it, a deprivation, what its deprivation is, when it opened, and when it closed. And so, and notice that now there are NAs that are here, but an NA for closed is actually fine because it's just telling us that it's still open. So I thought this was actually like a really like nice little first set of wrangling. I'm wondering if how this felt for different people. I really loved, instead of just using separate, like using the better separate wider delim, which is actually fairly new. I think it's only like 2 or 3 years old. And being able to do this. I was wondering if there's anything else that people were struck by this transformation.
Yeah, one thing is that you have to make a decision on how you're gonna deal with weird data. So that I think that that's part of um, I don't want to say that nobody teaches you how to do that, but in a way, nobody can teach you how to do that. You have to sort of like see your data and say, how do I want it to look like so that I can do a plot or I can work with that? And then you start making decisions. I think that for some people, that's sometimes difficult because they start saying, well, I don't know if this is the right way to go. Is this like, so this decision making process sometimes can become a little daunting for some people, especially newbies. but I think it's just a matter of just go with it and try. And I think Nicola talks a lot about that on her social media, Blue Sky specifically. She always says, well, I started with this data set and I wanted this chart. I had this idea and this is what I wanted. But once I saw it, I realized it's not what I wanted. So I had to start from scratch. I had to delete all of this and then go back to the drawing board and start working on it. So I love seeing her like thought process, including these decisions or on how to handle this, because there are a million ways where you on how you could have handled the open closed thing with like the colon. You could have done, because there are strings, you could have used string R or something in order to remove the numbers, etc. So there are like a million more ways to do it. So I that's the thing I'm having most fun with this book. Anyway, I don't know if that made any sense, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially with the next part. Um, like she acknowledges in the book that there are many ways to do the thing that she did. Um, and I appreciate, and there's almost an invitation to figure out what those other ways are, um, which I also appreciated. Okay, share screen for the next part.
John, you
You're
muted.
muted. Yes.
Thank you. I was just gonna say, what I was saying was that so like this is not the data set that she needs yet to graph, right? Because here every row is a museum. When she needs every row to be it either needs to be ideally every row would be a year, with each column being a deprivation index, or at the very least, can you get each row to be a year and one deprivation index, and then you can pivot later on. And so she's like, okay, so we need to make a function. And so the function, I think, is the function might actually have been my favorite part of the book, because it was the part that I feel like was actually stretching the most in terms of like everything else I feel like was actually pretty standard from the tidyverse, but the way that this worked, I thought was just really cool. So like she defines a function, which is where for each year and each index using the museum data, can you filter the data through that deprivation index? And then the number open are everything. I always love when people use a sum with a logical statement. And so whenever you do a sum with a logical statement, every true is a one and every false is a zero. And so what this will do is this will sum for every line. All of the ones that are opened under the year will be ones. And so this is basically saying how many museums were open at that time, how many of them opened before that time. Then this is how many closed before that time. And so the numbers that are open is the number that were open minus the number that closed. And you return that. And so I just thought it's so elegant. It's like so easy, but I just thought that function was just a really fun way of thinking about how do you actually make the data set that you want. And so Nicola then went on. She wanted this to be from 1960 to 2021. That's important because the Tidy Tuesday she used was from 2022. And so this was actually the extent of the years that I don't know about the 1960 part, but at least the 2021 was the extent of where she could work from. And then she has the 10 deprivatization index. And so she calls the thing from 1 to 10. And then she basically maps it where she wants the output to be, can you please, for all of the years and all of the departments, can you please run this function that I've created? And then this, I don't think this returns as a tibble. I think it returns it as a vector. And so then she's wondering, okay, can you make that into a matrix for me? Which will then make it into a tibble, and you are ready to graph. And then she checks herself by basically, from this data set, I have something currently that has all of the years, except what I think it does is every deprivation index is a column. And for plotting, it's generally nice to have things as long as possible. And so then she finishes with a pivot. And so can the pivot actually make those deprivations as its own label? And then the number of museums work out. So if I run this, actually I'm going to run it. I might run it bit by bit instead. So let me give him years, departments. So if I look at output, I see that output is not a tibble or a data frame. I can see that because the output runs in the values part and not in the data part. And so because of that, this is just everything is here. It's not very nice. But if I change the results, so this basically, everything is, the output is like one line, one vector. But if I do the results, then basically the results will make it into a vector, into a matrix. But this is still not great because this is showing these are empty because the years haven't been put in. And the 0 through 10, and this is like, it is still very much not, it is showing 10 columns, one for each deprivatization index. It is showing all of these rows for all of the years, but nothing has actually been defined yet. And so the last thing she does is I need to give these column names. So if I do that, now if I go to results, now notice it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then if you take plot data and you do it, then like she finally has the year, the deprivatization, and the number of museums. And I just thought this was, I feel like this was the part where I feel like a little bit of the magic happened in terms of going from like a data frame that is really nice for looking at individual museums to a data frame that's looking at the year results. And I also felt the most need to actually work through the code myself in going through this to understand everything she was going and to understand what the data frame looked like in each instance. I was wondering if there's like any questions that people had. What were people thinking, either if they worked through this or even just like seeing me go through it, like any questions that you all may be thinking about?
I don't have any question, but so I didn't actually go through the chapter before, but watching you go through the chapter like this is actually quite helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, I think that it's kind of the power of what she was able to do in taking a data set that had something and making into a different data set that had something else. I feel like a lot of people who work with Tidy Tuesday data sets, they actually don't do a tremendous amount of wrangling, but for this one in particular, I feel like you did. And so then she makes a plot. And I feel like something that I love about the tidyverse is just how easy it is to make a plot. And so this is the first one. Bam. And so I think that, so she already knows the first thing she says is, this is a busy plot. And also like kind of, there's a lot of rules that I think that she implicitly names that like we have to think about when we have plots like this. It's like it has 10 colors on one plot, which is not great for being able to tell things apart. And so I feel like the first thing she thinks about is, okay, so I'm probably going to be doing facets. But as she kind of goes into this, um, she understands that what's lost when you do a facet is sometimes when you do a facet, especially with line graphs, you can't actually compare them to each other very well. And so like you can see that everything is going up in a facet individually, but without being able to have those other graphs within it, you don't actually get to see what changes there are that have been made. So that's when she kind of decides, okay, I'm going to use the gghighlight package, because what the gghighlight package actually does is it kind of keeps, the good thing about a facet is you can see each line individually, but it also allows all the other lines to come through so you get those comparison points. And so I do love that she's like, I understand different best practices, and the gghighlight lets me use those different best practices. It's like I know I shouldn't have many colors on a plot, and I also know for line graphs I want to be able to make comparisons, which is sometimes really hard to do using a facet. And then what she decides to do here, and this is I think actually kind of interesting, is she notices that nearly everyone starts at around the same spot. And so because of that, she wonders if it might be, since right here the count is number of museums, she actually kind of makes an in the moment decision to do a last bit of wrangling and to actually make it about percent growth over the years. And I think that that was an interesting idea. I don't know if she was doing it because she kind of wanted to show how it could be done. I actually was kind of okay with the plot being the number of museums because you do have to do a little bit of work when you have a percent change graph. And percent change graphs to me actually sometimes introduce bias because it makes you wonder what the beginning numbers are. And so I kind of think she may have been doing it to show how you do this, as opposed to maybe it be also being like a legitimate thing that she suggested everyone should do with every graph. And so to do that, she says, I'm going to use 1960 as my my origin. So what this is this lookup has the number of museums that were open in the year 1960 for each of those privatization ones. And then she basically says for everyone else, so I'm going to left join that, which means that now every single one of those plots will have the she selected at the end. I'm going to actually run it twice. I'm going to run it without the select so that you see what happens. So she says, I want you to left join that. And then we're going to do a change, which is the number of museums currently, subtracting the number of museums in 1960 divided by the number of museums in 1960, which is a percent change. I'm going to multiply it by 100. So I'm actually showing it as a percent. So you'll notice if I run that, I'm going to run it first without the select out. What you'll see is that what she did is she has the number of museums in 1960, the number of museums. So like 103 minus 103, that's 0% change. The first ones will be like, and so, and for this one, 1962, there were 58. There are 58. There were 51. 58 minus 51 is 7. 7 over 51 is about 13%. And so this way she's actually doing like an in the moment idea of being like, I actually would like this better instead of being a number of museums to be a percent change of museums. Like this now. So what does this new plot look like? This new plot now is normalized, where 0 means that the number of museums are the same as in 1960. So I'm like kind of on the fence about like what was the big change between these two plots. Because I'm thinking about 10. So 10, you'll notice base when it's normalized, 10 actually comes up near the top, right? It's the third one down. And so what's tricky about this is it's had the greatest percent change, but if you look at where it started, it actually had the fewest museums at the start. And so I just think that something about something about this, it feels like there's another layer sometimes of explanation when you make a percent change plot, that you have to remind people constantly that the ground point isn't the number of museums. The ground point is the number of museums in that place in 1960. And I can't remember if she completely discusses that, but while I was working through this, that was like, just like something that I was trying to think about. Just gonna pause for questions because the last part is all of the stylings that she adds on to make this. This is basically the graph. Everything after this is how to make this graph look pretty. I'm also noticing we have 15 minutes, so I'm going to work through the styling stuff. So for the styling, the background color, she says is white. The text color, she says is black. Just going to keep those there. She uses the Varieties library, which for people who haven't used it, it's a really common one because their colors, the colors that are in there are generally accepted as being fine with the three dominant forms of color blindness. And so the Varieties color, there's one that like everyone knows, but the Varieties library actually has a few others as well that are really good for being able to do that. And so there we go. So when she does that, now the plot has these colors to it. So I actually, because each color was in an individual plot, she probably doesn't actually need to use the Varieties library because you don't need the colors to be differentiated from each other, but it's still nice. They're nice ones. The next thing she does is she wants to change the text that's being used. And so she uses the show text library. I know that she has all the libraries at the top. I just, for the purpose of this, wanted to connect the library specifically to the thing that she's trying to do. And so she uses Railway, which is a nice font. And so she wants the body to be Railway. And here are the title and the subtitle and the caption that she has. I thought something that was interesting was that, especially for her caption, she uses HTML to really easily put in the break in lines. And so instead of, the other option would be to use Markdown and to use like a double space and an enter. She uses HTML. So she uses the BR for breaks. And so then when she has it, she's able to, it's here. Mine is messy because I haven't made the I haven't changed the size yet, but you can see how it works. And then the last thing she does is she does GG text. I actually don't think you need GG view. I use GG view sometimes when I'm doing things because GG view allows you to really easily see what the best dimensions will be for a plot. But the final one she has is going to work through all of these. Was she wants the scale Y to go from Z to make sure that 0 shows up as the bottom. Because remember, that's no change. She wants a Cartesian coordinate. She starts with minimal, which is pretty common. Minimal is like, give me white to begin with, and I'll add stuff on from there. She says, I want to remove the legend. because it doesn't matter. They're already in the strips of the facets. I want the plot title and caption. What the plot does is it aligns it with the square of the entire thing. What ggplot usually does is instead you can see here it's aligned with what's called the panel, which is basically it's aligned with the x-axis of the graph. But what plot does is it aligns it instead with the beginning of the image. And so I want the spacing of the panels. This is really good for facets. Where are those panels going to be? I want them to have a unit of 1 lines. I want them to have a specific margin. I want the background to be white, and I want the paneled background to be white. And so what this will do is now they kind of disappear and bleed into each other. And then I'm going to say, what do I want my title to look like? What do I want my subtitle to look like? What do I want my caption to look like? And what do I want my axis to look like? And so all of these will give you what she has as her final plot, which is actually not great to see here, but is much easier to see here. And so that's sort of how she got there. I had not seen element text box simple used so easily. But I think why she chose to do that is so that the HTML is easy to translate into those breaks. So I think if you were to just do it without that, I'm not 100% sure that those breaks would show up, but I'd double check it. But I really enjoyed just like working through the whole process and learning a couple of other things going through it.
Yeah, definitely, because we're learning about ggplot, but in reality, she's teaching us also about data cleaning and data wrangling. So this book is really, really like well-rounded, very well thought of, and it's a gem. I keep finding little things here and there, like, oh, okay, so I already knew how to like add a caption or stuff like that, or the breaks, but I didn't know how to use, and I put it in here. I've never seen that change used in Mutate, and little things like that. Like there are little gems here that I am not sure anybody talks about it because it's not in the in the ggplot book. It definitely is not. So I think that the only way that you can learn about this is if you read the documentation, obviously, or if you're paying attention to Tidy Tuesday and then you're seeing like, oh, people are using it like this and that. But this is like a way of having it everything centralized and combined. I am really enjoying this book. Yeah, she's a genius, but I mean, we already knew that.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the text box, the element here. This has the element text box. I think is one of Klaus Wilke's. Gigi Text, I think, is him. If anyone has read, I think it's Elements of Data Visualization which is also a book club, but one of his packages.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
read it before this one. That's how
yeah,
that's to be. But anyway, yeah.
yeah. But this is where it does look like it is a way to put HTML into something easily, which maybe he talked about in that book.
So like I said, all of these things are like scattered throughout different blogs, different GitHub repositories. She just is centralizing them into one place. This book is like, yeah, I am gonna keep reading and reading and reading this book like many, many times.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you mean with the element text. Yeah, I see. So cool. All right. Anyone else has any other comments or any other things that they would like to discuss? All right then, John, thank you so much. This was like brilliant, super clear. You walked us through it, and you're making me want to make the jump to positron. Well, I already want to do the jump, but you're like encouraging me to do the jump. I'm just so used to RStudio that yeah, but I need to explore positron definitely. Even if I don't end up using it and I stay in RStudio, I think I need to make the jump. Um, yeah, so thank you so much. This was very thorough and super well explained. Thank you so much for that. So we'll see if you want to present next week. If not, don't worry about it. Just let me know. And then the following week is going to be Hyro. Thank you, Hyro, so much for that too. And then, yeah, I'll see you all next week. I'm going to write stop